Good morning, good afternoon, and good night to others who have joined us from different parts of the globe. I'm so happy to see you all again after our opening ceremony. So today's topic is very novel topic, which is climate and psychoanalysis. As we all know, it won't be wrong to say man is a product of nature. It has evolved out of nature. So like we all say, Mother Nature. So it is there, the mutual use of nature and man is using the nature is always been there and is allowed, permitted, and is good. But in its delusion of power and omnipotence, it has started abusing it, misusing it. So this is something which is mutually self-sabotaging and self-defeating. Today, I welcome Sally and Della both, and we are going to hear your views and also the reasons why men, and we are one of them, why we are doing that, why we are being so naive about it, why we are ignoring the potential hazards and the harm which we are actually causing ourselves. So I just pass over to our President, Dr. Mishra, who is presiding over the ceremony. She would be introducing our August guests, and then our meeting will start. So again, welcome all of you.
So, today we are having our first webinar in the series of our centenary celebration. It is going to be, we have decided that every month, all the 3 chapters of Indian Psychoanalytical Society, they will actually hold a seminar or a webinar, and this is the first in the series. The first in the series, but I think probably a very important one, given the very recent incident, 2 very important incidents. One, Houston is freezing, Texas is freezing. And secondly, here in India, not even 15 days, I think 7 days back, we had one of the glaciers on one of our rivers, Rishi Ganga, which burst open. It is 210 people are missing. 60 dead bodies have been found. And this was, according to the environmentalist, the result of the hydroelectric power that they were trying to build and manufacture a dam, a tunnel. So the tunnel actually now is completely blocked by mud, and rescue work is going day and night on war footing. All this actually points out that we are playing with the nature, and nature actually is taking its revenge. Why this is happening? Why aren't we aware of the destruction that we are doing to the environment and its disastrous consequences? That requires psychoanalytic interpretation. Sally Weintraub is a pioneer in the area of climate and psychoanalysis. So let me just introduce her, because the first paper, we will begin with Sally's paper. So Sally Weintraub is a psychoanalyst. She is a fellow of British Psychoanalytic Society, and she is a founder member of Climate Psychology Alliance. She is chair of International Psychoanalytic Association's Committee on Climate. She was a member of senior staff at Tavistock Clinic in London, and an honorary senior lecturer at University College London. Currently, she writes and talks on climate change and our relationship with the environment. In 2021, she won an IPA Community Award for her work in the area of climate. She has a new book out in April 2021, And the name of the book is Psychological Roots of the Climate Crisis, Neoliberal Exceptionalisms and Culture of Uncare. Sally, over to you.
Would you like me to start? Okay,
yes,
lovely.
Please.
Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Great, great. I'm just going to put my... Lovely. I'm going to pull up my talk. Just a moment. Recording, just... Yeah, I'm going to pull up my talk. Hello, everybody. It's lovely to see so many faces I don't know and people from around the world that I do know, and to see very cherished colleagues. So I'm going to just read this talk on my screen. Will somebody call out if anything goes wrong? You can't hear me or something. Okay. Well, it's an honor to have been invited to talk to you today, and an especial honor to be part of the program celebrating the 100th anniversary of the Indian Psychoanalytical Society. Thank you so much. It's also a great pleasure to be on a webinar with Delaram Habibi-Kohlen and Dr. Pushpa Misra, President of the Indian Society, both of whom I have come to see as my sisters. We three are members of a climate committee set up about a year ago by the International Psychoanalytic Association, and very much at the instigation of Virginia Ungar. There are 8 of us on this committee representing the global north and the global south, and knowing full well that the global south is being much more heavily impacted by the climate crisis than the global north, while the global north is more responsible for the level of emissions. The climate crisis is much too large a subject to cover in just one talk, and so is the question, what light can psychoanalysis shed on this crisis? I will pick up a few strands to start a discussion, but first of all, some context. People currently face multiple threats to survival, the corona pandemic and an unfolding economic crisis. Corona has made crystal clear that humanity faces a common storm, but some are more protected than others in this storm, and many are facing destitution. Also, we see growing instability, polarization, and fracturing in democratic structures across the world. The president-elect of the American Psychoanalytic Association, Kerry Sorkovitz, rightly observed that the viral pandemic has brought with it an anxiety pandemic. However, I see this anxiety pandemic as touching on existential anxiety that currently is deeper even than anxiety about COVID, and deeper even than anxiety about the state of economies around the world, and anxieties about a tearing social fabric. I suggest that many people are also experiencing existential anxiety about the damaged state of the climate and the environment. They know, even while keeping their knowledge largely out of their conscious awareness, many of us, that they depend utterly on what nature provides. I would, in a way, Bharti, I would disagree with you in saying we're growing out of nature. I think we're absolutely in nature and part of nature and dependent on nature. A counter-argument is often brought that most people have more pressing and immediate concerns than to worry about the climate. I disagree, but to fully go into why requires embedding a psychoanalytic view within a framework that includes culture, politics, and ecology. One sign of the presence of existential anxiety about climate is that we see people are trying to manage it by hovering between experiencing too little anxiety and too much anxiety. An example of too little anxiety is someone who said to me, "What a relief that the climate has recovered so much since the coronavirus." Now, belief in this rosy picture may bring this person relief, but it is actually a false belief. The facts are that global heating is showing signs now of accelerating, and just two worrying indications are that the permafrost has now started to melt, releasing methane, a highly dangerous greenhouse gas, and intense wildfires in the Arctic last June, released more polluting gases into the Earth's atmosphere than in any other month in 18 years of data collection by European climate scientists. Now, hearing these facts may heighten anxiety to such intolerable levels that the facts are then experienced as too much, and then they are psychically defended against. Anxiety is a vital alarm call, a necessary prod, letting us know that fast remedial action is needed. And experiencing too little anxiety is maladaptive, while experiencing too much anxiety may have complex strands. On the one hand, seeing the degree of environmental devastation that has already occurred can feel just overwhelming. And then people need to protect themselves and do protect themselves from feeling overwhelmed. On the other hand, it's too much, best think about something else, can also be a way of more actively keeping oneself dissociated from concern. To explore why climate change is by now so hard to think about, I will introduce the idea of bubbles. A bubble is a collective psychic retreat from reality. Bubbles are largely socially constructed. My subject is the climate bubble, a particular sort of bubble that minimizes moral unease that people would feel if they were to step out and see the real world clearly. This bubble is kept inflated through often subtle cultural pressure to collude with slippery, corrupting arguments. The world as seen from inside the bubble is a virtual, as if, fake world. Unsustainable behavior is thought of as normal and usual, indeed the only way. And inside the bubble, people can act without counting the true cost. The mechanisms that preserve a bubble like this are largely maintained by unconscious group pressures, and people in the bubble are largely unaware of this. The climate bubble has been seeded, inflated, and then maintained largely through a culture of uncare, meaning a culture whose perverse aim is to encourage people to disassociate or distance themselves from the part of them that cares and is socially responsible. The culture of uncare actively seeks to boost people's infantile omnipotence and thus to regress them psychologically. Beyond the thought that such a culture promotes spiritual drift and leaves people psychiatrically disinherited. In the new book I've written, Psychological Roots of the Climate Crisis, I argue that neoliberalism's culture of uncare, which includes advertising, media, political propaganda, and social group pressure, works to undermine being caring and taking social responsibility. The culture of uncare is designed to make ignoring others and future generations seem unproblematic, and that, I argue, has suited the needs of a deregulated neoliberal economy. The climate bubble is far larger, far more damaging, and far more consequential than any bubble in human history. It has involved planning to extract all for now for the few, with storms and instability for the rest. The climate bubble has served a particular sanitizing psychological function, which is to bleach violence, death, and suffering from the picture. Pushpa's just referred to a small part, but highly significant part of that suffering in India. The bubble is now bursting. It must burst, as, like all bubbles, it's based on omnipotent magical thinking. The damage and the suffering caused by this bubble are now too huge to conceal. One sign of the climate bubble bursting is that more people are talking openly about the state of the climate. Hannah Siegel argued that to stay silent is the real crime. I would add that the silence about climate has kept this bubble afloat long enough for the resulting damage to by now be staggering. Now that the climate bubble is bursting, very broadly speaking, people are responding in two main ways. One is trying to preserve bubble thinking with fight-flight responses, and the other is struggling to face reality, with, of course, many of us veering between these two. I'm going to concentrate on how hard it is to face climate reality. But first, I will very briefly mention one common fight-flight response, which is Noah's Arkism. You know, Noah who was the exception who escaped in the Great Flood. The general fantasy system at work with this defense is based on the belief that we are in a privileged group entitled to be saved. Why? Because we're special and worth it. It is the others who will be sacrificed. There's a lot more to say about that, but I'm going to stick with how do we work through our feelings when we do start addressing the reality. So the rest of what I will say is addressed to those of us who are trying to cope with the shock of emerging from the climate bubble and trying to stay sane while facing climate reality today, when so much damage to our life support systems has already been done, and when some of it is irreparable. How do we face climate reality? And crucially, how do we work it through? And of course, working through is an ongoing process. I want to repeat that endlessly because I think this is how psychoanalysis sees. It's not just a question of facing reality, it's staying with it and working through all the thinking and emotional implications of staying with it. I believe we first need to appreciate that we face not one or a few, but a whole series of shocks. The first being that climate news is itself shocking. Global warming has largely happened during the last 40 years, which is also shocking. It is neoliberalism's legacy. Even more shocking is that very recently, warming has started to speed up. As I said earlier, the problem with climate reality is we tend to feel either too much or too little about it, veering between shock and disavowal when we minimize reality, with neither state helping us to think rationally, by which I mean thinking that contains and works through our feelings and bodily reactions. In addition to shock at the news itself, people are likely to feel assaulted by feelings that being in the bubble protected them from. Shame, once unconsciously shared out amongst members of the group, that's one of the functions of a group, may suddenly, when returned, feel particularly acute. When I heard about the vast number of animals who died in the Australian bushfires, I actually felt ashamed to be a member of my own species. Some feelings released will be melancholic and potentially paralyzing, while others, very painful, are lively and part of grieving. A further shock is realizing more clearly that most leaders currently in power across the world are continuing with policies leading to ecocide. This means that in effect, they do not care if people live or die. I mean that in a collective sense and in a political sense. Surely our leaders cannot be that collectively crazy. And knowing that they are is very hard to bear. Then there is the collapse of our own omnipotence, and this can cause further shock. Because we're no longer in a climate bubble, we have radically to reevaluate our sense of ourselves. We see we are vulnerable and unprotected when we thought we were invincible. Death suddenly feels closer and more real. We see how easily seducible we are and how prey to colluding with corrupting political propaganda designed to support our continuing with business as usual. and we may feel shocked that we allowed ourselves to be duped. At the same time, it's also deeply replenishing to emerge from a bubble, which is in effect a collective psychic retreat from reality, to see the real picture more clearly. Stepping out of the bubble enables us to see strength and beauty in the interconnected systems that support life, and also to see the fragility in those systems, and the moral imperative for humans to respect their limits in the way they live their lives. So with this background, my question is, how do we work through the tragedy unfolding and stay sane? We need to find the answers together. For my part, these days, I read as much environmental news as possible, but never ever before writing or sleeping, as I find it too disturbing and it makes me anxious, and I'm not alone. Many people are reporting eco-anxiety, which, unless crippling, is on the side of life. It is care's alarm call to face reality and to act in whatever way we can. We may feel traumatized by climate news. Trauma, as we know, can overwhelm the capacity to think clearly. It can leave people struggling with feeling over and underwhelmed by the traumatizing events. Traumatized people can find it harder to judge whom is to blame with any sense of proportion. They are prone to disassociate from the traumatizing event, and that can lead to further disassociation, leading to a destructive cycle of increasing dissociation, which may then gather momentum. I bring in that perspective not to spread gloom, but to alert us to potential forces operating within us as well as in others, so that we might understand them and recognize them better if and when they take hold. Just before leaving this, I want to add that, of course, being traumatized by climate news will reactivate previous individual and generational traumas. It's another thing to bear in mind. I found studying war trauma in soldiers very helpful in thinking about potential climate trauma. First identified is post-traumatic stress disorder, which we know as PTSD. And this is when one's sense of safety has been traumatically shattered, and one may constantly relive the trauma in the present, feeling that danger may strike again at any moment. This is called hyperarousal. Many PTSD sufferers eventually convert hyperarousal into hyperconstriction, where all emotions, even pleasure, are toned down and experiences are avoided that might evoke any feelings of threat. So one question is, to what extent are many of us hypervigilantly on the lookout for climate information and using hyperconstriction to simultaneously shut it out? This could be a way for us to try to protect our hearts and minds from being overwhelmed in traumatizing conditions. Then there's pre-traumatic stress disorder, which is trauma that soldiers suffer in prolonged situations of helpless anticipation of a future traumatizing event. The psychiatrist Lisa van Susteren sees our stress at anticipating impending climate breakdown as a form of pre-traumatic stress disorder. And of course, right now, people across the world and climate refugees are already experiencing traumatic climate events, their situation worsened by COVID-19 and the added economic hardship it brings. When a journalist asked me, how do we tell people about the climate emergency without traumatizing them? I said, well, it's actually not easy to know how, but I firmly believe what matters is whether we give truthful pictures about the future in a caring way, not in a careless, switched off way that does not relate to how people might be feeling. I heard a child say, school told us today, Mummy, that the world is about to end. Is that true? Her parent answered, of course it's not true, and immediately changed the subject. I suggest that bald answer, while true in a strict sense, abandoned the child and delegitimized the child's voice and concern. And then there's rage. People are experiencing rage at injustice, feeling dismissed and not respected right across the world. And rage can actually fuel the will to act for the better, but it can also be part of a trauma reaction, in which case it's more likely to be loveless and tending towards hate acts, repetitive, destructive grievance, and identifying with the traumatizers, which is why we need to pay very close attention to whether we might be feeling traumatized. I'm now going to turn to moral injury, the violation of our sense of what's right. And again, I'm going to look at soldiers for guidance. Studying stories of morally injured soldiers reveals this pattern: a sense of betrayal by a leadership that idealized the view and hid the truth, that lied, that devalued life and was casual about killing, the helplessness of feeling caught up in a vast machine that prevents one from acting with care and conscience, the collapse of one's inner ideals, feeling one's own experience and sense of reality is brushed aside and does not count. Now, this could be a description of what many people report feeling about the economic and political world in which they live, a world that inevitably generates a climate crisis. The global economy now structures how people live in ways that conflict with their ordinary human decency. Daily life for the more affluent is fraught with moral dilemmas. Do I take the car, the bus, or the bike? Do I switch on the air conditioning when conditions get too hot because of climate change? Do I buy that book online from a company that employs people on 0 hours contracts? What do I do when nearly everything I buy comes wrapped up in plastic? My very way of living causes environmental and social damage. And how do I live with the guilt and shame of my participation? Suffering moral injury is a sign of mental health, not disorder. It means one's conscience is alive. And staunching and repairing moral injury involves a lot of psychic work, facing remorse, seeking forgiveness, gaining new understanding of one's individual culpability, and being able to place that in a wider context. It is in these ways that shattered ideals can be rebuilt and what's right refound amid scars. Judith Herman, who studied survivors of trauma, is one of a number who have argued that social action serves as, I quote her, the strongest antidote to traumatic experience, creating an alliance with others based on cooperation and shared purpose. I believe that breaking with the current culture of uncare requires a collective effort of working through grief, remorse, and a reshouldering of collective responsibility. And it matters greatly that this is undertaken in a spirit of forgiveness of self and other. The real tragedy with the climate bubble is that it allowed so much damage to accrue that facing climate reality now can feel unbearable. What I do know from my own experience is that trying to bear it and allowing myself to feel at times absolutely overwhelmed helps me better contain my distress and soften my rage. I find I'm more reflective and sadder, knowing I too profited from ignoring nature's limits, and I too colluded with the culture that worked to uncare me and us. Perhaps we need a tragic position alongside the psychoanalytic depressive position, and we need to find ways collectively to work this tragic position through. I want now to say a bit more about that by reading you parts of a poem by a young North American poet, Mia Nelson, about how the climate crisis leaves her feeling. Her poem is called "You Call It Eco-Trauma." Wendell Berry called it the peace of wild things, but really it was the ending of things that we saw no ending to, our feet standing on the sweet glacial edge of heaven. I call it waking up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat and knowing your mother is being killed in the next room, but not being able to move. I call it crying every birthday since I was 10, knowing nothing can save me, us, it, ours from time. It's funny. The only thing that can really save me is dark soil and waterfalls and sun. Suddenly, the moment you can see everything around you, when it finally becomes obvious, nothing this still and clear and God-bred I'll read that again. It finally becomes obvious. Nothing this still and clear and God-bred could belong to anyone who speaks our greedy language of want. I want to highlight these lines. I call it waking up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat and knowing your mother is being killed in the next room and not being able to move. These words speak to me, my way of seeing it, of one young person struggling with the tragic position. How do we work through and bear irreparable damage when we fear the good object that we need to help us with working through is died or is dying? The damaged good object here might be Earth being killed by ecocide. It might also refer to such dissociation that we no longer hear children's cries, even our own children's. Well, we do hear them and we are moved, but are we moved to the point where we're prepared to give up any privilege and make sacrifices for the next generation? Inside the climate bubble, this acute conflict is deadened and our caring part is dissociated from. Might this bubble-like deadened state also be the dead mother Mia is referring to? In my experience, children and young people, including young adults, are often very much more in touch with climate reality than their elders. They know they are the generation who will have to live in a world in which the elders allocated them so little entitlement. When Mia says, you call it eco-trauma, I call it knowing your mother is being killed in the next room, might she be speaking of the dead mother as a form of deafness that allows one group to leave all the suffering to be felt by another group? I believe neoliberalism's culture of uncare's most deadly appeal has been in its seductive promise that people can apparently dispense with inner moral struggle between what they may wish for and what is sustainable. However, to transition to a sustainable way of living, we need to stay with that conflict and consider Earth in every single thing we do. When we believe we are entitled to be spared the hassle of caring, we treat the lively reality-seeking part of ourselves as unimportant. We undermine its willpower. My last paragraph. The most treacherous fake promise offered by neoliberalism's self-serving, dominant culture of uncare is return to the bubble and you can be spared all inner discomfort. Hannah Siegel described the death drive as a wish to fall into the arms of a fantasy that the pain of living can be avoided. This is Freud's nirvana principle. The danger is that if the fossil fuel age is not ended very soon now, and sections of humanity do not bring rampant greed and injustice under control, reality will indeed become ever more unbearable and overwhelming, and people may increasingly be tempted to defend against too much psychic pain with the too little psychic pain defense. Thank you. That's the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Sally, for this wonderful paper. My request to the audience is that if you have any questions, we will have plenty of time for discussion. So if you have questions, please note it down. We will proceed with our second paper. And after listening to Dela's paper, we will then have discussion session where you can ask questions to both the speakers. And I now invite Dela to present her paper. Mrs. Delaram Habibi-Kohlen is a psychologist, psychoanalyst, and training analyst in private practice in Bergsisch, Gladbach, Germany. She is a member of the German Psychoanalytical Association, German Association for Psychoanalysis, Psychotherapy, Psychosomatics, and Depth Psychology. And of course, she is a member of the IPA. Publications are about societal and political issues, especially denial of climate change and microprocesses in transference and countertransference. In her institute, she is currently one of the 3 directors of training and has been active for many years in the acquisition of candidates. I request Dela to present her paper. Over to Dela.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, Dela, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. I feel very honored, and I'm very happy to be here with Sally also, with whom I have quite a long friendship now. And first of all, I would like to talk about what the paper is about. I will talk about the defense mechanisms that we use very widely, that Sally has already introduced, and I connected with the same subject that Sally has also touched, that is neoliberalism, and I'm trying to describe how this culture of neoliberal thinking, starting from the beginning of industrialization, has formed our defense mechanisms. Now, knowledge of climate change has existed for a long time, a longer time maybe that we're conscious of. The greenhouse effect was described as early as the 19th century, and the global climate was already a topic of discussion then. However, systematic research and hypothesizing only entered the public discourse through the publications of the Club of Rome in 1972 and 1974, and through the subsequent institutions that investigated anthropogenic global warming or collected and analyzed studies. For example, the IPCC. Since then, research on global warming and its connection to the increase in carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases has grown enormously, and there's hardly any doubt among scientists about man-made climate change. The fact that climate change is happening faster than expected, and that the predicted figures of the IPCC are being exceeded, is also gradually coming into the public consciousness. However, the question of all those who deal with global warming remains virulent. Why is there no adequate reaction to the known facts on the political as well as on the individual side. Now, this article will deal with the artifice of the psychic defense in the individual and how the overall social development of postmodernity has inscribed itself into our defense mechanisms. The psychic is incredibly adaptable. It enables us to survive even in traumatic situations. It seeks to avoid pain and it wants to protect us. It engages in dangerous maneuvers. It splits and it divides. It produces fissures. It bends. It throws out the unlovable without regard for loss. At the beginning of his odyssey through the mental apparatus, Freud divided it into the conscious and the unconscious. But then he realized that this was too simple. For that which keeps or makes unpleasant and painful things unconscious is not even accessible to consciousness. So he came to accept three agencies, the ego, the id, and the superego. In his later work, he did not reject this completely, but came to the hypothesis of the life and death drive, which he understood as antagonists, but which nevertheless complement each other. At every stage of his research, he always saw the mind, and as part of it, its manager, the ego, as conflicting, complicated, and extremely agile. So it is complex, it is ambivalent, it is largely unconscious and non-rational. So this is what most people do not believe. We rely on the belief that human beings are mostly rational. The inner reality, which psychoanalysts regard as the main field of work, is embedded and interacts with the outer reality. But I think the word interacting is too simple. Inner and outer reality are interwoven and shape each other in an ongoing process. What we perceive on the outside is at least partly made by our inside. For example, if we see someone as dangerous and aggressive because of our life history experiences, we behave accordingly, that is, attacking or even submissive, and the other person then becomes aggressive in parts because they feel they are being treated in this way and believe they have to defend themselves against this accusation they perceive. But objects and things outside ourselves also enter us and shape us. The most obvious example are the digital natives whose smartphone use thumbs evoke an enlarged corresponding brain area. The zeitgeist in which we move very naturally and which seems self-evident to us also shapes our consciousness and our unconsciousness, and thus also our defenses. A psychoanalyst who is very interested in external reality, Shmuel Ehrlich, puts forward the thesis that the present development of civilization has achieved a level of prosperity as never before, and that it is precisely this that accounts for our subjective unhappiness. I cite him. If by civilization we understand first and foremost today's Western culture and its global manifestations, we must recognize that we live in an age of omnipotence. Man has indeed taken the place of God and no longer considers anything impossible. This omnipotence, this hubris, is reflected in grandiosity, selfishness, and in a tendency to replacing the superego with the ideal ego. One cause of the subject's unease is therefore the omnipotent promise of today's civilization, a promise of happiness, health, domination, and an all-overpowering love. All this is not only held out in a prospect at great expense, but offered in a template-like, ready-to-use manner for immediate consumption. Thus, it is inevitable that the individual feels a tension between his daily lot and his omnipotent fantasies of love and happiness, beauty and wisdom, peace, and a life without suffering. This tension is constantly fed by the perception of what is lacking, fueling the ever-accessible feelings of envy and greed. End of citation. The wanting to have more and more is thus explained by the tension between today's claim to paradise and reality. It poses the question of possible renunciation and adherence to limits, and thus strikes at the heart of what constitutes our question. Why do we do nothing? Since industrialization, we have lived with the promise and the belief that everything is feasible, that development is growth, and ever greater production of mass, that there are hardly any limits to the human spirit's inventiveness and urge to explore, and this not only serves global prosperity, but also a liberation from restrictive limits. In the Western industrial nations, we live in an abundance that makes lack unimaginable. Moreover, the availability of things is hardly subject to a waiting period anymore, and we have become very accustomed to the land of milk and honey. The price of all this is alienation in the broadest sense, not only the alienation of the worker from his product and from the labor processes, that is Karl Marx, is meant here, but the alienation between people and also between generations, and alienation from nature and also from things. It's about a relationship to the world that is disturbed because man no longer feels connected to it. In view of globalization, with its everything is connected with everything, this seems paradoxical. However, this connectedness is only possible if each individual locks himself up in a micro cell, or colloquially in his bubble, which promises safety and security. This does not only apply to the highly specialized world of work, but also to the group of one's ethos or lifestyle. This cultural context that surrounds us is the common ground for the defenses against the climate crisis, since the entire defense is permeated by alienation. Alienation leads to functional and instrumentalized compulsion to optimize and perfect in connection with ever more rapid acceleration. This also affects working life as well as the relationship to one's own body, fitness and resilience, as well as relationships with other people who are supposed to bring something. The pressure for perfection, together with the glorification of, there is some echo here. I haven't changed anything. Okay. That leads to further individualization, to the need for retreat and freedom in contrast to the pressure to perform. At the same time, however, this pressure is also linked to the narcissistically gratifying promise of being something special and of having earned something special. This socio-cultural context leads to a loss of solidarity and apathy in society as a whole. The unmanageability and ever-increasing density of global interconnections and dependencies minimize the individual's feeling of self-effectiveness and further contribute to withdrawal and consumerism. All of this needs to be taken into account when describing the forms of defense common today, which are embedded in this initial social situation. Now, I'm going to talk about the different facets of defense. If we speak of denial as an umbrella term of defense against climate change, this is not to be located in a vacuum, but it is permeated by alienation in its various expressions. Denial is more than a simple denial of climate change. This still occurs, of course, but it is gradually giving way to scientific fact. Nor is this denial a deliberate lie. This, on the other hand, this deliberate lie, it exists, and it is found in deliberate manipulation, which is organized, planned, and institutionalized. As far as manipulation is concerned, however, it should be said that the individual adopts the lie unquestioningly and unconsciously when reflection is culturally devalued and promises people that they can quickly have what they want. The age of fake news, in which the opposite can be asserted unabashedly and contrary to all verifiable facts, points to the fact that the regression to effortless wishful thinking and apparent lack of inner conflict is well advanced. This means that simple denial, that I don't want it to be true, so it isn't, can gain more ground after all. Denial of the climate crisis, however, is generally first about a very stable form of defense in conjunction with other defense mechanisms in which something is both known and not known at the same time. You probably all know that the British call that turning a blind eye. The expression goes back to Admiral Nelson, who disregarded the flag signal to retreat at the Naval Battle of Copenhagen in 1801 by raising his binoculars to his glass eye and correctly saying he saw nothing. This kind of defense, which, unlike Admiral Nelson's, takes place unconsciously, and it follows a very complex maneuver in which several things are condensed. Something is seen, sensed, known, but this is subjected to secondary processing, at the end of which what is known no longer has any meaning. It becomes apparent that denial in the sense of turning a blind eye is accompanied and supported by many other companions of defense, such as repression, something is forgotten or shoved aside, rationalization, the reason why something should not be changeable is reasonably substantiated, displacement, something is shunted to a side stage, projection, blame or causation is attributed to someone else, isolation, an idea is separated from the associated feeling, devaluation, something or someone is not worth being noticed, taken seriously, idealization, someone or something is exaggerated and not only good motives, and only good motives and abilities are attributed to it. Omnipotence, oneself or others, are perceived as invulnerable, omniscient, and omnipotent, and many more. These forms of denial are also so stable because the scientific facts are not denied. Climate change is seen, but its consequences are declared meaningless. First of all, it should be noted that we all have a more or less defensive attitude towards climate change. Otherwise, we probably could not survive psychologically. To be permanently aware of what the world will look like in 60 years or less. That is, to keep in mind that the civilizational collapse that will happen unless there is a major global effort to reduce fossil fuel consumption is not only beyond the capacity of comprehension, but also the individual's potential for endurance, which would then no longer be able to cope with everyday life. And what we look away from are heat waves, storms, floods, uninhabitability of the southern hemisphere, famines, global migration movements, wars over water, civil wars, escalating terrorism, increasing totalitarianism of governments, and many more dangers. In order to become aware of this, at least to the extent that humans come into climate-related meaningful action, the necessity of at least a partial defense must first be recognized. For climate change, climate crisis, and climate catastrophe are identity shattering in their ultimate message. They say you have to change something. Or maybe you have to change everything even. And they entail the question, but what can I change? In combination with this are fears of losing one's own possessions, one's previous lifestyle, which provides prestige, comfort, and thus feelings of security and safety. Last but not least, feelings of guilt about one's own lifestyle, which further cements the existing injustices between the northern and southern hemisphere, are virulent. Now, I'm going to talk about denial in connection with omnipotence, devaluation, and projection. Climate change skeptics, as they falsely call themselves, because they are not really skeptical or doubting, but they firmly believe in the non-existence of anthropogenic global warming. They like to see themselves as reasonable and rational and demand provable figures that are certain, 100% certain. Here, for example, it is claimed that climate change has always existed. This is undoubtedly true. However, the crucial detail that the speed of warming has a connection with the time since industrialization is thereby considered with a blind eye. At the same time, polarization often takes place, with climate activists being called sweeping names such as liars, fantasists, hysterical, socialists, lunatics, etc. The mechanism of projection is also found here. In climate-denying media propaganda, an irrationality is hidden behind the apparent rationality, which comes to the fore in the affect of rage with which climate-minded people are ridiculed, denounced, devalued, and humiliated. The omnipotence visible here is a form of defense in which one believes oneself to be invulnerable and in which one declares the other to be weak in order not to feel feelings of one's own weakness, dependency, and helplessness. The vehemence of contempt for the other testifies to the danger of these feelings if one were to acknowledge them for oneself. This form of denial is often found in the organized form of lobbying, fossil lobbying. Stokoe names some typical characteristics of this, such as the assumption of conspiracies, for example, against capital, the use of false experts, the cherry picking of the weakest scientific articles to denigrate the entire field, the demand for ever more watertight figures, and the use of false analogies and logical fallacies. What seems important here is that the actors usually use an unfair generalization, an emotionalization, polarization, and dramatization in which there is no longer any pretense of a factual debate. It is more a matter of inflaming, in which the other side is declared the absolute enemy. Now, I'm going to skip a bit. Now, I'm coming to talk about denial with the mechanism of isolation. The climate crisis is so enormous, affecting all areas and spaces of life, water, earth, air, that it does not fit with parceled life. One of the most important defenses is to try to force it back into the parcel nevertheless. Isolation is a helpful support here. In the process, the climate crisis is kept separate from other problems that are also crises. Destroying the connection with the various global difficulties is essential here. Thus, the following world problems are listed as if existing side by side. Pandemic is one thing, climate crisis is another. But I just heard a talk by a German virologist with Luisa Neubauer, who is the counterpart of Greta Thunberg in Germany. And Karl Lauterbach said that the warming is doing something to the animals that they cannot adopt, and they produce many more viruses that have been unknown so far. And also the deforestation of the tropical forests cause animals and human beings coming closer together. And all this probably produces more pandemics in the oncoming years, more and more pandemics that we are confronted with. And so we can see here the very close connection between climate crisis and pandemics. And with the usage of the mechanism of isolation, this is split apart, and it is seen as two crises that have nothing to do with each other. Other crises named are economic crisis, social polarization and fundamentalism, terrorism, refugee crisis, and the list can be extended. The multi-causal interconnections between these problems can be overlooked, so that each problem in itself seems smaller and more manageable. This is to push fear aside that the climate crisis, already much more threatening to existence in the Southern Hemisphere than here, where I live, causes and at least intensifies migration movements, that it creates economic pressure and mass unemployment, that it causes wars, for example, for water, that it causes wars, also for other raw materials, over raw materials and for territories, that the fear that arises from this leads to further fundamentalism and social division. And I already mentioned the deforestation that leads to pandemics. Many people are not even aware of these fears because the pre-consciously felt connections are already cut in advance. The fears then continue to operate unconsciously. The isolation of the various problems results in a leveling of all problems. If being able to list a multitude of crises, an imperceptible equaling in prioritization occurs. If we name 10 different problems in a row, this has the effect of making them all seem equally important. However, they cannot be tackled at the same time. So we first deal with the one that causes the least difficulties and the easiest to get rid of with concrete action. Climate change always brings up the rear because it is too complex, too interdependent, too unpromising, and too long-term. So it is always dealt with at last. This procrastination is embedded in a quarterly focused learned over decades, in which the profits of the next 3 months, which are supposed to keep growing, are decisive for current action. If you enter thinking in quarters into the internet, a lot of articles about family-run or nature-loving farms appear, which contrast the 3 months attitude with thinking in generations. This also can include doing without something new now for better production. For example, keeping a fallow to regenerate the soil. Such a view is less alienating because it involves a more immediate approach to the product. It considers large contexts. However, it is not common and it is demanding. The fact that something we do or that we don't do today will have consequences for future generations may be abstractly obvious to many of us, but it does not determine our actions. We are no longer connected to the following generations because family ties are far less strong than they were 50 years ago, due to the individualizing dynamics. This disconnectedness is also found in the defenses that no longer even recognize our dependence and interconnectedness with nature. People say, that is so sad about the polar bears, they're so cute. People also say, people need nature to recover from stressful city life. In these sentences, nature is experienced as something outside of ourselves and our center of life. More than that, nature is functionalized as something that serves our well-being, but we hardly experience ourselves as nature. Cycles of growth and decay are no longer perceptible, which also has to do with the perpetual availability of everything edible, which we all no longer want to do without. However, it is hidden that this has a price, which also has to do with fossil overexploitation. Hartmut Rosa, a German sociologist, calls this a mute world relationship in which we no longer have resonance with nature. The result is a split in which nature is either romanticized, cute polar bears, beautiful landscapes, or experienced as threatening and too subjugating. A virus is then not seen as favored by humans in its spread by bringing animals and humans closer together in densely packed markets or by destroying animal habitats. Even the extinction of species, the death of coral reefs, is not seen as something that endangers ourselves to the highest degree, but as something that is a pity. Now, I see that my paper is too long to fit in time. Maybe I talk a bit about denial with rationalization, and then I cut it short a bit more. Now, rationalization. What can I do if there are still large-scale meat factories, if the forest is cleared for the benefit of lignite production, if even the whole of Germany goes along with it? China, India, Australia, the USA continue to spew such enormous emissions into the air. Politicians are responsible. The big structures have to change. Politics shifts its responsibility to the individual when it only demands renunciation of consumption and makes appeals. How can I demand from third world countries, that they renounce the prosperity we have after we have profited so much from them? But that means potentiated emissions. All these sentences are true to some extent. Rationalization means that there is some truth in the argument, but that this is meant to disguise the actual motive, namely a defense. The arguments mentioned here are supposed to justify why renouncing consumption or resource use seems pointless and will have no effect. Behind this, however, is often the secret and very understandable desire to be able to continue doing things as before, in the slipstream of good reasoning. For example, flying, ordering from Amazon, individualized driving, in short, consuming. This is a very complex mixture, for consumption is not just about convenience. The comfort, abundance, and effortlessness that we do not want to give up are ultimately rooted in the defense against fear and helplessness. These arise under the pressure of demands on an individual who is largely isolated from social ties, who is supposed to permanently invent, enhance, and realize himself, but who, despite all apparent freedom, is externally determined due to the multitude of interdependencies in which he is involved. And now there's a bit about fetishism. The fantasy is that there will be no water shortage once the technology is efficient enough to desalinate seawater, that there will be no more forest dieback, no more extinction of species when carbon dioxide can be sucked out of the atmosphere and stored back into the ground, that there will be enough protection for everyone when we have made ourselves completely independent of the surrounding world and live under a dome, that hunger and waves of migration will be stopped when we'll be able to produce food completely synthetically. All these fantasies counter the horror of the tipping points, the complete uncontrollability of storms, droughts, frosts, heat waves, floods, with something reassuring and a promise that life will go on as usual without restriction. Here, the respective hype technology becomes a fetish, an all-curing wonder weapon that promises us independence, control, and availability. And above all, that we don't have to change anything. An example of the continuation of the familiar, which gives us security, is the rebound effect. If we save energy by using electricity more efficiently, we consume just as much, or even more, by leaving everything on standby. Renunciation or restriction in contemporary thinking means that you are on the loser's side and that you have not managed to prove to the limit that it does not exist. So, sorry for the silence. I'm looking what is really important still in my lecture here. Okay, the last chapter is about digital capitalism. This insidiously transforms and distorts our values. It puts economic dictates above the common ground. It denounces weakness as something inferior. For example, I observed this with the young generation, that the word victim functions as a swear word. Also, digital capitalism assigns empathy to weakness. Empathy there is reinterpreted as a weakness in leadership. But it puts profit above social togetherness. Stinginess is cool. It transforms leisure into busy entertainment. Acceleration dynamics are also found in leisure time. This is important if one wants to understand the common inner attitudes that affect climate change more deeply. They share about our lifestyle, resource consumption, and what values are important to us. The Frankfurt School with Erich Fromm, Herbert Marcuse, and also later Pierre Bourdieu and Hartmut Rosa put this in context with alienation and outlined a specific mode of relating to the world, perhaps most vividly described by Fromm as the mode of having, in contrast to the mode of being. The having mode is about efficiency and apparent rationality. It is about the expedient, competition, and this mode leads to reification and commodification. Feelings are thereby fast-moving and kick-ass. Critics of civilization have found similar images for this, such as frenzied standstill, this is by Virilio, or fleeting modernity, this is by Zygmunt Bauman, or acceleration, this is by Hartmut Rosa. The emptying of the soul described by these authors in favor of a material, concrete surface world on the outside led them to the paradoxical realization that more and faster leads to less and less satisfaction, and the petering out of creative pressure through individualization and the now accepted truth that everyone is the architect of their own happiness. Even creativity and interpersonal relationships are subjected to the question of how does this get me ahead? When the fear of being left behind grows, as it has in these times, massively intensified by the pandemic and the awareness of the unpredictability of the future, envy and also the fear of the envy of others grow. Thus, attitudes that are frequently encountered are those that focus on the lack of justice in terms of having and entitlement. Ultimately, these arguments are aimed at saying that there is no point anyway, because it cannot be done fairly, and therefore one can carry on as before. It hurts to be seen as a loser, as someone who does without something and ends up having less than before. The idea that one could have more by consuming less does not come about because the value system is measured in terms of money, possessions, speed, wealth, etc. Now, what can we, I skipped the parts of withdrawal and apathy and come to my conclusion. What we need in order not to despair is a realistic view of the climate crisis that does not deny that the world will be exposed to drastic changes already in this century. If we think today about the fact that the world in which our children and grandchildren will have to cope will be nowhere near as safe as ours, we can think more specifically about what needs to be done to reduce global warming. In Germany, there's a lot of discussion now going on about how transformation can be done without civilization coming to a collapse because of civil wars and the groups civil war. How can this transformation be done from the kind of capitalism we have now to be turned into a cycle? I don't know the exact word, cycle economy, where you only produce what does not lead to enormous waste. And I'm very happy to see that this is becoming a debate that is growing and growing. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dela. So over to our president, Dr. Mishra.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Both the papers are now open for discussion, but before we start our discussion, very briefly, I would like to recapitulate both the papers just in 5 minutes so that audience can be reminded of the basic things that our speakers have talked about. In fact, Sally in her paper has talked about the bubble, the climate bubble, which encapsulates us from all the trauma that actually we will face once we actually are aware of the climate crisis. She has talked about neoliberalism policy of uncare. This policy, this culture of uncare actually leads to infantile omnipotence as well as it regresses us psychologically. She has talked about PTSD, taken the soldiers, the trauma of the soldiers, war soldiers, as one of the examples, and she has based her own climate trauma on PTSD of war soldiers. She has again talked about PTSD as well as pre-traumatic stress disorder. So both in these connections, you can ask her questions. And Dela, of course, Dela has just read her paper, so you really remember how she has actually tried to relate various defenses that we are taking with the socio-political culture that is present. So open for discussion. The papers are now open for discussion. When you ask your question, please introduce yourself, give your name, and ask the question.
Yeah, Virginia, you can go on. Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Uh, First, thank you very much for inviting me to be here with you today as part of the celebration of the centenary of the Indian Society. And we've heard two remarkable presentations. And I would like to be brief and to go back to what Sally started in a way quoting Hannah Siegel, whom I was very fortunate to know her and to have supervisions. And she was a woman in a remarkable position at that time, very worried about, she was concerned about the future of the world. And you know that she fought for peace and against war, and also was interested in these topics. I would like to go back to what Sally, you quoted beautifully, stay silent is a real crime, is a real crime. And I think that she was right. So what I would like to say is that from a couple of years to now, within the IPA, the climate change and the problems and what we are facing has a voice. And thanks to the leadership of Sally and her committee, there is not only describing, you know, what's going on and the problems we are facing, but also we can see the attitude and the wish to study in a deep way from the psychoanalytic point of view. And I think this is very important because psychoanalysis has to have a word regarding what is going on and what could happen. So in what I would like to say, in some way, if I'm not wrong, you can tell me there, you are trying to study the global situation from different point of view that we cannot avoid now, the economic, the political point of view, the differences that we have in our world and even in our international organizations regarding culture, regarding inequities and so on, but also to study the human attitude. And it's psychoanalysis who can have a word. And that's why I'm very grateful and I'm very glad that today we are discussing in this way from the global perspective to the singular, because we psychoanalysts deal with singular, the analytic process. But from there, as you know, climate change is part of the structure we inaugurated, IPA in the community. So we go from the, you know, taking into account that we have a very valuable method that is the psychoanalytic method, we are able to study and to do what you are, you know, remarkably doing. So only one, I would like, we can debate many things, but you know, while you were giving your presentations, it came to my mind the video that was organized by your committee, Sally. It was a wonderful video that included the perspective of a child and the grandmother. And I can tell you that even if it is a very difficult world and it's a very difficult situation, that we have to accept that we humans are destroying our own resources. But I'm feeling a little bit optimistic because I'm a child analyst and I can witness that children in many situations, they have a different attitude. They take care about nature, they take care about what they are eating, what they are doing, what are we doing with our resources. And in a way, I feel optimistic that we could have an influence in the future generation. Thank you very much for your contributions that were remarkable.
Thank you, Virginia. Thank you very much for your comments.
Dela, have you got, do you want to respond to what Virginia said?
Other than I agree, I don't have nothing to say to that.
Thank you, Virginia. There's lots to say. You spoke about the children, and I think one of the things that I wanted to highlight in my talk is that I think we're in danger of letting the children, us older people and adults, letting the children down because we don't actually listen to them, or we try to draw them into the very sort of cultural defenses that Dela so beautifully outlined. And it's a form of deafness, you know, and I think it's a particularly cruel form of deafness, and we don't want to recognize the cruelty. That's what's kept outside the bubble, because they are our children and we're leaving them to face this, you know. And I think the problem is that, you know, I would add to what Dela's saying that I think the problem with disavowal, it's like an onion. You keep revealing deeper and deeper layers of it. It never ends, you know, this turning a blind eye. Is that, and I'm very encouraged by the upsurge of protest at the moment about privilege and inequality, because I think that it invites us to really struggle with to understand our blindness to our wanting to maintain privilege. And I think we tend to see it only as material privilege. What the Black Lives Matter protests have really shown me is that the privilege is to stay in a world, in a bubble in which we do not have to face suffering. It is the others who suffer in so many different ways. And I think, you know, so I think part of denial is actually being willing to do a lot of deconstructive work on ourselves and our communities, really talk about these issues and face some of them in a deeper way that might enable us to see the world differently. I like you, think that there's a lot of hope in the situation. The problem is, because of the denial, the pace of it all is too slow. It would be the ultimate tragedy if people change just too late to avoid climate tipping points. That is the real danger. Can I just make one other point about just responding to Dela? I absolutely loved the way that you talked about isolationism, that you hive off climate as a separate issue. And there's so much reflected, you know, my problem in the talk today, which I actually cut down, it was much longer. But, you know, I started saying, well, there are a whole lot of problems, and I listed them. And it's exactly the problem, you know, that you described. And interestingly, climate is always culturally the one left out. There's always something more important to talk about than climate. And I thought that the way that you talked about the interconnection, and I had a bit about that in my talk as well, and I took it out because they're all interconnected. And actually, the one thing you're not allowed to say, culturally, it's a taboo, is that actually climate is driving the whole thing. It's our relationship to the earth that is driving all these other problems. That's the big thing one's not allowed to say. So, you know, one's in a climate where you're talking about, well, what could, you know, what's climate change possibly got to do with us? It's got everything to do with everything. So anyway, I love the way you articulated that.
Can I say something? It just came to my mind that I had an argument with my husband. This argument lasted about a decade. And because he always told me, oh, well, what is the thing about climate change? Climate change is not the problem. The problem is how we live. And I always told him, well, don't you see that I'm just exactly saying that? And climate change is only a symptom. But it was something that because he saw it as if I was saying this is one circled out problem that he did not understand that I meant it to be connected with everything else, and so, but now he understood. So.
Well, that's great, Ella. And Adriana wants to say something. Yes, Adriana.
Thank you, Bharti. Well, hello all. Thank you very much for the invitation, Bharti and Pushpa, to be present today. And sorry again for not having made it on the inaugural session. Thank you for the speakers. I really enjoyed the two papers, and it's the first time I've come across to your work, and I found it very, very interesting. I think I'm an analyst from South America, for those of you who doesn't know me, and I think so I'm from the Southern Hemisphere that you have referred. And I think psychoanalysis have a big contribution to make in, it is a voice that has to be in this issue, among the economics, among the politics, among the social. Psychoanalysis is obviously, as we all know, it is a theory about man and about human affairs, because it's anything related to man is concerned about. Is it a problem with the volume, Bharti? Or somebody
Well, yeah. If you can say closer to the machine, or you, then probably it will be a little louder.
Okay, I'll try. But I hope you've heard the beginning. It's about
Yes, we did.
And I think, well, the importance of psychoanalysis having to make to bring awareness and give voice to from what psychoanalysis can do, which is to bring the perspective of man and how man relates to himself and obviously with environment. And from that perspective, I recently seen a movie that just been released in Netflix. I don't know if any of you have seen it. Perhaps the English analysts that are with us today have seen it, and it's called The Dig, D-I-G, The Dig.
Yes.
British.
Yes.
Saturn Hill, the discovery. Well, there is a moment in the film at the end when Ralph Fiennes is talking with a child, and he's crying because he talks about how he has failed his mother. And I think it's a lovely conversation about failing or failure. And basically what he says is we always fail. And I think this little dialogue is enormous because of his, this is, I think, what psychoanalysis is about. It's about bringing this aspect, this side of us as constantly failing, and what we can do with this failing, and how, and I think it's because of this denial of this of this fragility and vulnerability that is in us and in our environment, that we almost happens this like kind of repetition compulsion that if we don't stop it, it really is a path to death. Really, I really love the anecdote of Abner Nelson that Delaram brought. Is turning the blind eye, the origin of this expression, because this is what, well, psychoanalysis can bring in a way, is do we want to see or we don't want to see? We do have the best, and the worst is in our hands. We are capable of humans, and this is something psychoanalysis can say and says a lot about how we, can, the best and the worst, we're capable of the best and the worst. And this is, well, individually and socially as well. So the power of man to damage itself and his environment is as bigger as the power of restoring it. So this is the fight and the tension that I think psychoanalysis can bring about, this tension because yes, there's the need to prosper. There was this talk about prosperity and change and transformation, but this is the tension about the costs and what we do with our lives, with our environment. So thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to hear both papers today.
Okay. Thank you, Adriana. Anyone else? I think I saw Harriet taking a lot of notes. Harriet, would you like to comment? Hello.
Yes, I had to unmute. Thanks, Pushpa. You're right. I did take a lot of notes.
Yeah.
I think that's one way I cope. One of my anchoring methods. I thank both speakers for their talks. They were informative and alarming, actually. And I think insofar as the two of you have been able to put into words what we face and how we're facing it, I think that helps us be somewhat hopeful. I found, I think what I wanted to say is that first, that Sally's metaphor of the bubble is very effective, I think, because it contains fragility, the fragility of our situation, but in a kind of everyday, potentially digestible way. It's something I think we can use to hold our knowledge about defenses that Della elaborated with such strength and clarity. But the longer you spoke, Della, the more anxious I became, because you make so clear how how deeply defensive we are. We are organized. There's background that we are organized in a way that obscures, I think, existential dread, which, you know, with the current climate problems in southern United States, that terrible rupture in India with so many injuries and deaths, you know, we're now with social media, I think the sense of urgency is greater. In a way, it helps the general public face what's happening to the world. And one other point I want to make is how much I appreciate that both Sally and Della feature the necessity to think in an interdisciplinary way, to help psychoanalysts as well as the rest of the world understand that the political, societal, economic, you know, is interrelated with our psychic life, our development, and our ongoing experience. That we, you know, psychoanalysis for a long time lived in a bubble, its own version of a bubble. And I think it's one of the reasons I feel hopeful is that you are helping us chart a course where we have a greater, where we have a more explicit relationship with the world and what we might be able to bring the world. So also, one last thought. Sally, you brought us, I thought, such an important point with the suggestion we add the tragic position to the depressive position. I think for me, that opens a door on how to deal constructively with the defensive structure that Della elaborated so thoroughly. So thank you both, and Pushpa, and
Thank you.
Darji, and everybody.
Thank you. Shubhranshu, do you want to say, do you want to make any comment?
Pushpadi, Jui wants to say something, probably her hands is up.
Oh, okay. Juhi.
Yeah, Jui, you can go on. Seems she's not there. She just by mistake put her hands up.
Okay, Shubhranshu, do you want to make any
Yes,
comment?
yes, Pushpadi. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yes, I have already mentioned my question in the chat box. I am curious. First of all, I am very much grateful to be invited to listen to these amazing papers. And I really didn't have much idea about this interrelation between climate and psychoanalysis. But I enjoyed both the papers very much. So I'm curious to know whether uh, our concern regarding the external climate or environment can be a projection of our concern regarding my inner climate or inner psychic well-being, which we cannot voice out properly. And always in our poetry and in many our art forms, we find that environment gives us sort of metaphoric language in which we can express our inner turbulence or inner disturbance. Can we analyze this concern about environment or climate and infer something about our inner psychic disturbance as well in this time, especially during this pandemic time?
Well, I would invite Sally to answer that question, because Sally, it comes to the question that we have been discussing so many times in our, almost in our every meeting, how to distinguish between the outer reality and the inner reality. So Sally, I invite you to answer that question.
I love the question, actually. I think, as Della was pointing out, there's an interpenetration between the external and the internal. But I'd like to approach it from the point of view of looking at fragility, which has been raised twice, I think, by Harriet and also somebody else. I'm sorry, I forget, but fragility. I think that I've become much more interested recently in fragility, and I'm finding myself trying to distinguish between, roughly speaking, two sorts of human fragility, because we are very fragile. We're very, very dependent creatures from birth and right throughout our lives on what sustains us, body and mind. We're very fragile. But the two sorts I'm distinguishing are, and one's been exacerbated by COVID, is the whole issue of transience, fear of death, and the need for illusion to help us to bear the unbearable. Because I think human beings face the unbearable. I mean, Jonathan Lear, an American analyst, actually has said, why do we assume that human beings can actually bear reality? Anyway, there's that sort of unbearable, which comes with facing our own deaths, which Freud said is impossible anyway, and facing transience, needing help with groups, and also the presence of nature to help us face transience and loss and so on. And so, and the need, and we paper it over with illusion, and we need to, I think there's nothing in what either Della or I is saying that wants to sort of downgrade the need for human illusion. We can't get rid of it anyway. It's absolutely basic to us. That's one sort of fragility, that things are hard to bear. But I think our age has ushered forth another kind of fragility, which is that the way that society is economically and culturally now organized is actually going out of control, and it's facing people with what is really unbearable to face. It's a consequence of, I would say, a not needed way of living that is not inevitable. And I won't go on, but just one point. Della, you talked about the fossil fuel age arising at the start of industrialization, which is true, and global warming. However, if you look at graphs, you'll see that it massively jumped from the 1980s onwards, when a particular form of capitalism which was very deregulated and wanted to abolish all limits and justify itself with an ideology that promotes omnipotent thinking, took hold. Now, that economic form is caused far more damage than was done before. And I think the urgent question now, and I think it's producing unbearable living conditions, psychically unbearable and physically unbearable. You know, human beings were absolutely, this is a different sort of anxiety to even anxiety about our own death, I think. It's, you know, and the tragedy is that it's not even necessary, actually. It's anyway, so I wanted to make that point and to say that the urgent task, as I see it now, is what sort of frameworks do we need to put in place? Social frameworks, psychic frameworks, it's at all levels that can help us actually contain our destructiveness and enable our love. Because I think those sorts of social frameworks are what is needed. And a lot of repair work needs to be done. But so, and this new unbearable is driving different forms of, frankly, more and more crazy illusions, conspiracy theories, and, you know, making people very vulnerable to being captured by right-wing despotic leaders and so on and so forth.
Thank you, Sally.
Thank
Any
you,
other
madam.
any other question? No questions?
Well, in that case, I would like to just say something and ask something also.
Okay, go ahead.
I was just wondering while listening to both your presentation, which was wonderful, I was just going back in time and wondering about when we were less individualistic and more, you know, socialistic. There were communities which were, whether it was because of a geographical reason, because of religion, because of race, because of whatever it is, but they had more, I would say, variety, more inclusion. There were different kind of people of different ages, different kind of material possession, rich and poor, different kind of intellect. So it was a very wholesome thing when that kind of groups or community or societies used to be there. Then we started on to this individualistic, whether we call it capitalism, whether we call it, you know, industrialism, whether we call it actually the individualistic progression, which I really, you know, I'm finding it difficult to call it a progression, but that is how it is seen. And then, you know, even now there are groups in this individualistic society. There are groups, but these groups are very, very homogeneous. There is no heterogeneity, there is no variety. So if there are poor, so that is a group. If there is laborer, so that is a group. So if there are industrialists, then that is a group. So probably when we are talking about climate and nature and biodiversity, probably this is, I was just wondering, probably breaking down of this heterogeneity and turning it into this homogeneity probably has destroyed a lot of, you know, flora and fauna, not only in nature, but also in our psyche. So I would just like to hear from what you people think about it, because in India, we used to be a very, very, you know, close-knit social society, you know, the community. We had different religion and different geographical reason and a lot of variety. But now it is turning into more of, again, you know, industrialism, laborers, poor and rich, and you know, the classification goes according to the work or the job or the, you know, digitalization, which Della, so digital capitalization, which Della mentioned. So I feel it's really very, very sad. So I would just like to hear from you, what do you people feel about it?
Okay, Della, would you like to comment on Bharti's questions?
Yes, I feel that the individualization is something that is driving people apart from each other, and that your question connects with what can we do about it? And I haven't, maybe it's wishful thinking, but I see something emerging, at least in German society, that people come together a bit more in groups. When the danger becomes more conscious, of course, there are people who go back into retreat, but there are other people who have the urge to come together in groups and inform themselves more politically and discuss things. This is, I have maybe, I'm also in a kind of a bubble, in a small bubble, which is the Fridays for Future bubble, maybe, so to speak. But I have the idea that people are becoming more alert to what's going on, and they the kind of a spirit of the urge of transformation is becoming more and more. And I feel that we need to have more of a group think, because otherwise we will not be able to tackle the challenge of what's coming up and what we have to change.
I agree with that, and I also I think your point, Bharti, is very well taken, and it speaks to the need for cultural repair. And part of that cultural repair is repairing the damage done by disrespecting other cultures and different voices, you know, and actually coming to recognize just how much we have to learn from those other cultures that actually are more sustainable. So thank you.
Thank you, Sally, and thank you, Della. Any other questions? What happened to our students?
Zareen wants to say something. Yeah, Zareen, you can go on.
Like, as we were speaking, I was just thinking of this, the idea of, you know, the exploration of the planet Mars, and how, you know, we would go out there and colonize that and start all over again. Like we could leave all our troubles behind here. You know, again, this sort of total denial of what we've done here, the damage caused. We leave this planet and we shoot off, you know, in rockets or whatever, and we land on a totally new planet, okay? And we start here, and there's talk about harvesting the gravitational forces, which are different from ours, and how that can produce more food, you know, food, I think, more than anything else. Just thinking of, again, the defense mechanism and perhaps the need to escape from this, from, you know, what we've created here, and sort of travel, whatever, in rockets into the skies.
It's a lovely point, and it's like also we can leave everything that's human about us behind on Earth. That can be the human graveyard, and we'll go off, you know, in some triumphalist position. Yes. We'll conquer everything, yeah, and take no responsibility for anything. Mm.
Yes.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Can I just add, Pushpa? I do think, thank you for hanging in there, everybody. This is not a subject that's where webinars are a good forum, in the sense that, you know, it needs discussion, it needs us to be together. So, you know, I think we need to find ways to recognize we're together in spirit, you know, but it's not easy to discuss in so easy. So thank you. Just want to recognize that.
So thank you, Sally. If there are no more questions, then it's time for me to summarize whatever we have discussed today. Both the speakers actually have a common theme. I think both of them actually dealt with the question of why we are not so much alarmed as we should be about the climate change. And Sally talked about too much anxiety and too little anxiety. And the reason that I was very interested in arranging this seminar was that in India, we find that there is too little anxiety about climate change. And I have talked about this to Sally in many of our meetings and have emphasized that if a webinar can be arranged, probably our students will be aware of what kind of psychoanalytical process is going on in denying this alarming prospect that actually is awaiting us not too far away, but probably in the near future. So both Sally and Dela have emphasized upon the defenses that actually are leading us or making us not to look at the reality. Sally talked about, I loved the bubble phrase, the capsule in which we actually have put ourselves, the capsule of omnipotence, the capsule of that everything is right, not seeing the reality, the infantile omnipotence. That reminded me actually of something in the Mahabharata when the hero, the protagonist actually is answering a question. The questioner asked him, what is the strangest thing in the world? And the hero replies that every day so many people are dying and we are seeing how time eternal actually is cooking us and all of us are going to die. But we all think that everyone else will die, but I will not die. So that actually is something that Sally talked about, Noah-archism, that we are entitled as if a place in the Noah's Ark, that everyone else will die, but I will be there. So that is something which is a kind of very infantile omnipotence. This is what Sally has emphasized, that once the bubble bursts, the trauma will be unbearable. And the trauma actually, we will not able actually be to take the trauma. I also liked her analogy that my mother is actually being killed in the next room and she's unable to move. It is the mother nature who is being killed every day, every second, every minute, but we are unable to move. So this defense of denial, this defense of omnipotence, and this defense of living in a capsule completely devoid of recognizing the reality is something that she has emphasized. Similarly, Dela has actually taken into account our socio-political reality and has very intelligently and capably connected our various defenses to the socio-political nature, socio-political culture in the particular social environment. I particularly loved two of her defenses, the way she has connected it. One is isolation, namely we are simply keeping certain particular problems isolated. We are not looking at the global nature of the problems. For example, that pandemic actually could be connected with the climate change. That deforestation could be connected with the climate change. And all these things again are connected with, for example, the virus, the pandemic that we are facing right now. And in future, we will face probably many more viruses. So she is perfectly right. She says that if we isolate the problems, if we separate the problem, then we can deal with them and we can deny the global nature and the severity of the problem. And the second one that I actually loved is actually the way she has talked about the denial of scientific, denial of denial of the severity of climate change. When she says that scientific facts are not denied, but they are considered to be meaningless, this is so dangerous. It is better to deny. It is probably less serious, less damaging if you deny that there is no climate change and that it is not harmful. But the pretense of the pretense of actually understanding, accepting the scientific data and proving them meaningless, it is something very, very dangerous. So these are the defenses that we are taking. If we become aware of it, then probably, as Stella has pointed out, we should look at the climate change and the climate crisis in its proper perspective. Della also has talked about the question of alienation, a phrase which actually Marx used, and Marx actually used in the question in relation to the relationship of the worker with the product, and Della has used it in a much umbrella way, in a much broader and expansive sense. So Marx has used alienation also to explain mental disorder. In Marx's opinion, mental disorder actually did originate from alienation from the social reality, alienation from our external reality, our internal reality. So this alienation with what is happening to the external world, what is happening to our own inner psyche, this particular alienation, concept of alienation, the way she has used it in relation to climate change is something that I loved. So we all are becoming alienated with our real self, which actually is that we are part of the nature, we are in the nature ourselves. I am also reminded of Arne Naess's deep ecology, theory of deep ecology, that we actually have to think nature, not in terms of what it gives us, but we actually have to think that we simply are in the nature. It's not that nature provides us this and this and this, therefore it has a value. It has a value in itself. So these are the important things that actually have come out in the papers of our two esteemed speakers. And at the same time, from the discussions and comments that we have heard, we hope that this actually will help us in understanding the seriousness of the climate change and will actually help us start ourselves and help us in removing the denial that we are constantly using. Thank you very much to both our speakers. I now invite our secretary to offer a vote of thanks.
Thank you, Pushpadi. So, of course, thanks, Sally, for such a wonderful presentation. And thanks, Stella. Without you, this webinar wouldn't be possible. And, you know, with this webinar, we hope that people will, like Sally said, will start discussing and thinking about it. So thank you. Thanks a lot to both of you. And I thank Harriet for being with us throughout. I thanks Adriana. I thanks Virginia. She had to leave, but thanks still. And I thank our members from Delhi and Bombay and all our members, affiliate and students over here. This webinar cannot be done without the audience because the audience is to think and discuss and take it forward. And I hope that we in coming webinars also, we would be taking up pertinent topics and we would be seeing you all again. Thanks to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank
Thank
you.